Benjamin Friedman, 5 minutes.
Yeah, you might have to cut me off because I'm liable to go on a little too long. So just wave at me, and I'll ignore you. It's an honor for me to be up here with more eminent people all around, especially as the only advocate really of the ideology we're supposed to be debating, or at least the only pure advocate. I guess Brian's with me a little bit, but I think. Actually the imbalance of opinion and stature up here is indicative of what's going on in Washington for a long time. And, we're often told that there's, actually we were just told that there's excessive bickering and partisanship in Washington, which I guess is true. But on this subject, I think the trouble is bipartisan. There's consensus in favor of what I would call militarized global primacy, which wants lots of intervention of various kinds, the two most prominent of which are humanitarian intervention and the long-term kind of interventions we have in places like Western Europe and Asia. So debates going on within the 40-yard lines in this town, and I'm on about the 15. And so what I want to do is talk about why I disagree with the assumptions that underlie this set of ideas, this sort of bipartisan consensus. Before I do that, a couple preliminary points. One, I'm supposed to say how finances should affect our security. I think that's sort of like asking how gravity should affect air travel. I think it's sort of an unavoidable consideration. And certainly our Constitution's preamble says to provide for the common defense, but it doesn't say to do so wastefully. And in a world of limited resources, and there are no other sorts, all goods compete. Whatever you want to do, you're sacrificing something else with the dollars you could have been spending. So we always have to ask how much is enough. Second, some background on my view, where I'm coming from. I call it military restraint, not non-interventionism, because I'm not a pacifist. I'm generally for resisting the temptation to intervene, not exclusively though. So I'm for planning fewer wars, not none. So I call that restraint. I agree with our country's early leaders that continual wars centralize power at home and erode liberty, that alliances are a necessary evil, sometimes likely to pull us into wars remote from our interests, and therefore they should not be permanent, and that we should always, as we already heard, be a friend to liberty abroad, but not its armed vindicator, and that liberty spreads primarily by example. Now that approach dominated U.S. foreign policy for a long time, as you all know. It lost favor as the United States got more powerful and then had more opportunities to intervene abroad. And of course it lost favor as a result of its association with isolationism prior to World War II. But it remained present in Washington and foreign policy circles throughout the Cold War in the person of people like George Kennan and Hans Morgenthau, who were for balancing the Soviet Union, but not the global Cold War we got. And President Eisenhower largely subscribed to the restraint view, not entirely, but he fought to keep down defense spending for fear that it would erode liberty at home and strangle the economy. He wanted, therefore, to get U.S. troops out of Europe while he was president, or at least shortly thereafter. And he would certainly be for doing so today, and I think as a result, modern Republican leaders would call him an isolationist. Today, restraint lives on primarily among academic realists. It's been sort of exiled from Washington. I'm not mentioning all these people because I think that they would endorse or agree with every word I say, but I'm pointing out that the view I'm taking has a lot of history behind it and a lot of support from people who study this kind of stuff for a living. Now, somebody here, I think sooner or later, will say that restraint, what I'm talking about, abandons our ethical responsibilities abroad. But I say no, it follows from what Max Weber called an ethic of responsibility that gives pride of place to possible goods, particularly at home, not dreams that we chase abroad. Somebody might even call what I'm saying isolationist or a retreat from the world, but that too is wrong. It's consistent with free trade, immigration, cultural exchange, and treaties. But that said, I'm with Walter Lippmann, the long-dead famous columnist who once said that he was happy to be called an isolationist compared to the people that thought they could run the world. So what I'm talking about here is stopping trying to run the world with the American military. All right, so let's get to the guts here. What I want to talk about, I'm going to have to be criminally brief. I'm going to say four things, the four sort of insights that underline my departure from the conventional wisdom. One, occupying and trying to fix weak or failed states with ground forces is a generally terrible idea, whether we're fighting terrorists or not. The notion that counterterrorism requires fixing failed states with counterinsurgency misdiagnoses the causes of terrorism and overstates our ability to organize other people's politics. A tiny minority of failed states have provided haven for anti-American terrorists, but the leading example even of this phenomenon, Afghanistan of the 1990s, the trouble was more that the government, the Taliban, allied with al-Qaeda rather than the fact that there was no government. History says instead that terrorism comes largely from political conflicts and from people who are mostly losing them, not disorder per se, and that foreign powers become targets of terrorism largely as a result of participating in those conflicts. We always justify intervention in these sorts of states with comforting, nationalistic, and phony claims that the problems there stem from the inverse of our virtues and are thus corrected by liberalism, by spreading liberalism, or trying to. In doing so, I think we underestimate, ironically, the power of other people's nationalism or related isms that define ethnic or religious identities that are antagonized by foreign occupations and thus motivate people to fight it with violence, including terrorism. And to explain it is not to justify it, but I think that's where terrorism comes from. And for that reason, the history of Western powers attempting forcible state building in poor countries is characterized by bloody futility. Intervention for state building, by the way, as Senator Graham said, referred to at least, it's a remarkably progressive idea, something that bothers Republicans when the president is a Democrat. If you deny that our government can efficiently deliver the mail, it's odd to insist that it can deliver democracy or even stability to Afghanistan or Mesopotamia just because the delivery man in this case is a soldier. Second, we don't need to defend Europe from nothing, and Japan, South Korea, and others from dangers they can afford to deal with themselves. The Secretary of State said last year that alliances should be in our national DNA, not temporary. But I agree with George Washington, who thought they were a recipe for fighting other people's wars, and you ought to get out of them as soon as their initial purpose is met. We committed to defend these countries when they were weaker than enemies that we thought threatened us. Now they've grown wealthy, and the New Deal was sort of that we agree to defend them and they agree to let us. And I think that it causes a couple problems. They free ride. They spend less than they otherwise would on defense because we're providing it. And since money is fungible, that means we're subsidizing social welfare programs in those places. And by the way, I don't blame our allies for that, just as I don't feel bad about eating the free food I just got from the Common Sense Society. It's our fault. Our military commitments also encourage moral hazard, where our allies engage in reckless behavior because they know we're there to back them up. And you see that in Japan, I think, with leaders going to these shrine for war criminals. I think you see it to an extent in Israel. You've seen it in the past in Taiwan, and even in places like Georgia that we have not been foolish enough to give a formal commitment to defend to, but they thought maybe they had one and therefore did things that they otherwise might not have. So I think we're providing disincentives for accommodation among neighboring states, not stopping instability. And third, along those lines, contrary to the conventional wisdom, I don't think we provide international stability and guarantee commerce with our overseas bases and naval patrols. It's an incredibly popular idea that I think is wrong. I think it overstates our contribution to stability now and underestimates other states' ability to provide it for themselves in our absence. Neoconservatives, who apparently skipped all of their collegiate history classes except for the day when they talked about September 1938, say that without our support, our allies will despair of the effort to defend themselves and surrender to the nearest anti-American regime. I think leaving aside the question of in what cases that would actually be a security problem for us, the real history is that in international relations, without U.S. military deployments, potential rivals generally achieve a stable balance of power rather than surrender or fight, especially those separated by the sea like Japan and China. So if we go away, the idea that everything erupts into chaos and the earth is consumed in a ball of fire, I just don't think that's going to happen. And we have a lot of history that I could cite to justify it. And I think globalization actually makes it even less necessary to defend trade routes because it gives us supply options. Finally, the dirty secret of our defense politics is that we're pretty safe here in the United States because of wealth, geography, and technology, starting with nuclear weapons, before we send one troop abroad. And what passes for enemies these days are really quite limited compared to what great powers have seen in the past. And I think that's why we hear these more esoteric arguments about primacy so much now. So most of our interventions really, you can argue about the morality of it, and I think we ought to, but I think our security is not really at stake in most of these things. So to conclude, I'll just say that the pro-intervention arguments that I just attacked are more a consequence of global military commitments than their cause. Like most great powers in history, we exercise power where we can, and we call it self-defense or justice. And as our power has grown, these arguments have become more common and therefore more believed, while those like mine and some of these famous people I mentioned in the beginning have been discarded. People on my side tend to say that this state of affairs is unsustainable, but they're wrong. Unsustainable things, to paraphrase Herb Stein, who was a great economist, unsustainable things stop. And our problem is that we remain wealthy and safe enough to go on this way indefinitely, making foreign policy like rich people shop, ignoring costs and benefits, conflating ambition and safety, and treating narcissism as a virtue.